Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, go ahead now.
Okay. Well, 70 years ago, on 70 years ago yesterday, on June 6th, 1944, thousands of Canadians, along with many thousands of Americans and British troops and others, went ashore in the invasion of France. I think 250 Canadians died that first day, or in that battle, and 1,000 casualties altogether. This was the greatest seaborne invasion in history that we know of. I want to give you some background of that moment in history, and then tell you how this happened, how it came about. It was a battle for something good, but the evil that was there is still with us in the world. At that time, at the time of the invasion of France by the Allies in 1944, to get the Nazis out of Europe, at that time, the Russians, then the Soviet Union, were in the 58th day of a battle against the Nazis in the East. They were driving the German troops out of Romania at that time. And in that 58-day battle, about 150,000 Russian troops were killed or wounded. They were being attacked constantly by Nazi tanks. And it was very important for them to win this area because the Romanians there were true Nazis and had massacred the Jews there immediately when the war started with Russia. So this is a very emotional moment for the Russians. The night before the invasion of Normandy, the invasion of France, the night before, on June 5th, the American Chief of Military Planning, General George Marshall, went to the Soviet embassy, where he received a great honor. The Soviets gave him the highest honor of the Soviet Union, called the Order of Suvorov, named for an old Russian general who had never lost a battle. And really, they gave him this honor because he not only planned the invasion, which was supposed to relieve the Soviets of being the only people fighting the Germans, but he also had fought the British for 2 years to try to stop them from sabotaging the invasion of France by the US and the Allies. The British were trying to prolong the war by not allowing this invasion to go forward. So the Russians awarded him this honor. And he said, I am proud to receive this tonight. He's speaking at the embassy, in Soviet embassy in Washington. I'm proud to receive this tonight because Russia, the Soviet Union, is a place that has sacrificed on behalf of all humanity and has held the banner against the Nazis. A couple of days earlier, another representative of President Franklin Roosevelt was also in Russia, the Vice President, Henry Wallace. He was in Siberia. He had gone across the Pacific. Franklin Roosevelt had sent him there to tour Siberia and to go on to China. And Henry Wallace spoke, this is just a couple of days before the Normandy invasion. He spoke in Russian at an opera house in one of those cities in Siberia. And he said, after this war, the Americans and the Canadians and the Russians, we three countries, have to work together to develop the North. That is Siberia in Asia and Canada and Alaska in North America, so that we can have powerful industrial development and the joining forces of our two great sides of the Pacific. He went on to China, where he was discussing with the Chinese plans for developing China as a great world power after the war, including plans for the Three Gorges Dam. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela was 25 years old, beginning to have a struggle against the British Empire apartheid system, and he was inspired in this course of his life by the 1940 declaration by Franklin Roosevelt, which was also signed by Churchill, called the Atlantic Charter, that promised freedom to every country. And of course, Roosevelt did not just mean the countries conquered by the Nazis, he meant all the countries, including those conquered by the British. Sometime after that, Churchill denounced the Atlantic Charter. In India, at the time of the Normandy, or actually a year before the invasion of Normandy, FDR sent an American mission to India in 1943 to check up on why they weren't producing very much for the war effort. And they found that the British were trying to stop India from producing for the World War II effort. Why? Because if India produces in manufacturing, they will become skilled and they will become independent. And they had already put all of the India's national leadership in prison, Gandhi and Nehru and the entire leadership of the Congress Party. In Vietnam, at the same time, in 1944, our ally, Ho Chi Minh, was working in conjunction with Franklin Roosevelt's intelligence service, called the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, to fight against the Japanese invaders. And to a certain extent, you didn't have to call them invaders, because the French fascists had given Vietnam to the Japanese fascists. In Brazil, they had sent a Brazilian army alongside the Americans to invade Italy. And Brazil was producing modern equipment, producing steel in the most modern steel complex in the world, which had just been built, financed by Franklin Roosevelt's government, to begin to build up the power of South America. Mexico was a strong ally of the United States in the war. Back in 1938, President Roosevelt and his ambassador in Mexico had supported the government there, which was a New Deal government, Lázaro Cárdenas government. We supported them when they nationalized the oil of Standard Oil Company and Shell Oil Company. So Mexico was a very strong ally of the United States in World War II, and very important for intelligence south of the border. So at that time, you know, the United States was almost universally respected and beloved in the world. and at the height of its power. Even in Guatemala, they had an insurrection in 1944 to install a New Deal government, emulating Franklin Roosevelt, led by Jacobo Arbenz. So the U.S. agenda at that time, when we were fighting fascism, was the American Revolution, to be spread as a friendly thing to the rest of the world, not imposed. We were to be brothers with the other countries and help them build up. How had this happened? What was Roosevelt, who led this American policy, and how had this war, this terrible war of World War II, come about? How did that happen? I want to take you back from 1944, back 13 years earlier to 1921. And I'm going to show you what happened in the life of Franklin Roosevelt and in his spiritual development and in his mind that made him a revolutionary, and what he understood, what he knew, what he studied, what he came to know. Also, what he knew that Americans don't know today. At that time, in the beginning of the 1920s, Wall Street bankers, particularly Morgan, Rockefeller, Warburg, and Harriman, made a very strong partnership with British bankers, Lazard Frere, Rothschild, strategists from the Round Table Group, and the royal family. They made a political transatlantic partnership. And they were, at that point, spreading fascism, the new political movement, in Europe and Asia. That was the heart of this partnership between Wall Street and London. In 1922, they succeeded in putting Benito Mussolini in power in Italy. He was entirely a puppet of this transatlantic partnership. And they were trying to spread that fascist movement to Germany and to the militarists in Japan. At the same time, the United States was being ruined economically. There was some prosperity from a stock market boom and speculation for some people. But the farmers were being crushed, unions were being crushed, and it was clear that the bubble would cause a disaster in the economy. And because of all the dislocation in the United States at that time, and the fact that the Wall Street gangsters directly controlled the Republican presidency at that time, there was demoralization in the American population. Millions of people joined the Ku Klux Klan. It had been out of existence for many decades after the Civil War. It was the terrorist group, white supremacy group after the Civil War. It was out. It was gone. Then it was revived when Woodrow Wilson became president. So now in the 1920s, it's spreading across the North as well as the South. From Oklahoma up to Michigan, they had race riots by white people. They had 100,000 member Klan rallies. So this is what was going on at this moment. In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt was already in politics. Just to go back a couple of years and bring you back to this moment of 1921. He had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. And he was not really a very progressive man. He was born in wealth. He didn't have a huge amount of sympathy for the ordinary person. He did have some knowledge of the American Revolution because his family went back to one of the Roosevelts that was working closely with Alexander Hamilton. But personally, Franklin Roosevelt was very stiff, and he was a so-called reformer, like his distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt. In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt was the Democratic candidate for vice president, national vice president of the United States, with the Democratic presidential candidate Cox. And in the 1920 election, November 1920, they lost very, very badly because the Democratic Party had no connection to the ordinary people. Black people voted for Republicans, the party of Lincoln. Workers were having their unions crushed under Woodrow Wilson as well as the Republicans, so they had no great love for the Democrats. Farmers were being crushed. They were demoralized. They usually voted Republicans. And the only states that had voted for Roosevelt and Cox in 1920 were 12 southern states that had been in the Confederacy or slave states. The South had great control, along with Wall Street, over the Democratic Party. So Roosevelt lost this election for vice president in 1920. Less than a year later, in August 1921, he caught infantile paralysis, polio, at the age of 39, and he nearly died. His entire body was paralyzed for a time. He gradually got back the use of his hands and his upper body. And he was isolated from the public. He thought his life was over as a useful person. And he looked out on the world and saw this growing disaster, the rise of fascism, the rise of a global cartel of financiers to rule the world. They actually made cartels over all the great industries of the world: steel, chemicals, oil, and so forth. They shared it among Germans, Englishmen, and Americans. And they weren't loyal to any of those countries. This was an international financiers cartel. So this is the world that Franklin Roosevelt saw, helpless, lying there, or going eventually into physical therapy, into a tremendous battle to restore himself and get his powers to do something back. And in this struggle, he said to himself, how can I approach the revolution that needs to occur in the world? This has to change. How will that change? Two things are clear. One is that we need a fundamental revolution, and the other is that I'm going to have to do it. He saw that more and more clearly as he did his study and saw that he had some powers to move people and great powers to understand what was going on in the world and what was the history of it. The first thing that he did before he ever recovered the ability to walk was he bought thousands of books, many of them on American history, many of them also on European and other history, but mostly on American history, but also international strategy, military strategy. He bought all the works of Edgar Allan Poe and James Fenimore Cooper and the works published by Matthew and Henry Carey. He bought everything associated with Hamilton. And he began to look at the American Revolution and the mission of the United States as shown in that revolution as being the agenda really unfinished that he would have to take up, or anyone would have to take up who was going to be a revolutionary. In that study, he identified Alexander Hamilton as the principal shaper of the American Constitution and the savior of the American Union at the founding of the country. In 1925, I'm going to discuss this period now from 1921, when he caught polio and was devastated and crippled and remained crippled for the rest of his life. From 1921 until 1928, when he got back into office as governor of New York, and then 4 years later was elected president. So this period of about 7 years, 1921 to the middle of 28, he's running for governor, when he became a revolutionary, completely changed his point of view, changed his sympathies, partly because you see trouble yourself. You see how a person can be destroyed by circumstances, not their fault. And so this obviously gives sympathy to the ordinary person who's hit by troubles that a rich, idle person can never understand. But more deeply, he saw a way that he could lead the country in this period and save the world save civilization, really. That was the idea that he had in his mind. In the study of the American Revolution, he began to sketch out his own book on American history. I have seen his handwritten draft. There's only a few pages in existence in the archives at the Franklin Roosevelt Library, where I was a few weeks ago in Hyde Park, New York. I spent 4 days in there. And all that he wrote that we have only takes the course of history from the Middle Ages up to Columbus. He doesn't even go, he hasn't written, apparently, anything about the later history. But this is crucial because he saw the Dark Ages in Europe and how we got out of the Dark Ages. What's the problem in the Dark Ages? The majority, the great majority, 90%, 99%, he said 99% of the population are owned by the great nobility, by the barons and dukes and landowners, some church noblemen. They are ignorant. The common person has no say and they don't know anything. A renaissance begins where printing comes and spreads a certain amount of knowledge to literate people. But a key moment that he recorded in his writing was that a king, Louis XI of France, used the power of his monarchy to put down the power of the great nobles and hold them in check. And of course, he also stopped them from their interminable wars, the wars of the Middle Ages. So this idea of bringing about civilization, having giving birth again to a civilized humanity depends on putting down the powers of the great nobility and great barons and great private rulers of the world. And this is part of his, this is really the central theme in what in that little that he wrote there. He also wrote a movie scenario, a complete, I think 28 or so, I wrote it down, I don't remember exactly, but scenes. And it's about the life of John Paul Jones, an adventure story. Everything in it is true, except a couple of scenes thrown in for romantic interest. If you're making a movie, you have to have a woman in there, right? And why did he choose John Paul Jones? Well, this is the hero in the American Navy who, without much resources, we didn't have much of a navy in the Revolution, sailed across the Atlantic and took the war to the enemy, the imperial enemy, and went around the British Isles and sunk British ships in the English Channel. And Franklin Roosevelt records how Benjamin Franklin, and this would be in the movie, how Benjamin Franklin told John Paul Jones, land in the north of Britain and kidnap some British aristocrats and trade them for American prisoners. So this is part of the movie scenario. Starting to get the drift of his thinking? Hollywood did not accept this, but he had to do it in real life. The movie could still be made. It's in the public domain now, I suppose. In 1924, Roosevelt wrote a plan for world peace. And he said that we need to set up a society of nations different from the failed League of Nations. The two principal virtues of this were that there would be an executive committee of the great powers who had the greatest, logistical and military power. At that time, that was the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And if we set up this executive council, the rules and our practice would be to check any attempts by any of the members to start a war. We would also have the power to investigate and publicize wrongs and problems such as mistreatment of labor, mistreatment of natives, drug trafficking, the power to stop wars that are done on the pretext of debt collection. So what is he talking about? He's talking about the wars caused by the imperial system. One great difference with other conceptions for this kind of thing is that he specified in this plan that there is absolute national sovereignty of the members and that each country is governed by their own constitution. This is purely run by the interest of the countries in achieving this and cooperating. In 1925, he was already organizing a new Democratic Party, and he had not really regained, he had gone into public only a couple of times. Once he went to a convention and struggled to go up on the podium, supported by his son and by a cane. And they cheered when they saw him appear there because he was struggling so hard. That's when he nominated somebody for president in 1924. But otherwise, he was doing this behind the scenes. He was in touch with people all over the country who had been in touch with before, but now he was in a revolutionary mood. He understood the world. According to his aide, Louis Howe, who helped him organize everything, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped him. The two of them helped him, protect him, and let him do this vast study and this work while he was recovering. According to Louis Howe, Franklin Roosevelt was the most knowledgeable person in existence about American history. I can tell you that in his personal library that he donated to the presidential library, and you can go there and look at all these books, he had 22,000 personal books. Many thousands of them were bought and read in this period. And his growing commitment was to put on himself the responsibility for rescuing this political disaster that mankind was trapped in. How would he organize the Democratic Party if it's controlled by the South and Wall Street? In 1925, he wrote a very curious article that was published in the New York World on Jefferson and Hamilton, going back to the time of the 1790s. And in that article, he praised Thomas Jefferson. And he has some criticisms of Alexander Hamilton. He also has caveats, if you know what that word means. In other words, he tells the reader, by the way, this article was a review of a book that had just come out, a really stupid book. But it's published, you know, it had wide circulation, and he used this occasion to go on the public scene and say something important. He said that Hamilton had played an honorable role in stabilizing the finances of the country. And he said that when Jefferson was in a conflict with him, the party associated with Alexander Hamilton, the Federalists, were representative of the upper classes, the moneyed interests. He never said, that is, Roosevelt never said that Jefferson had a better program than Hamilton. He never discussed directly the program of the government of Jefferson versus Hamilton. He was making a point in this essay, in this article, that there was a movement at that time for which Jefferson was the figurehead, which involved the common people of the country going against the moneyed interests. Now remember that Jefferson was a Virginia plantation owner. And when he attacked Hamilton's nationalist program, the idea was these plantation owners do not want manufacturing in the country. You're only going to get manufacturing if the government promotes it. So the government shouldn't have any powers to do that. So does that mean that by publishing this article, the idea comes out that maybe Franklin Roosevelt has ambitions to be a Thomas Jefferson, that is to say, to become elected president and to go against the moneyed interests, to reach out to the common people. Now this is full of irony, it's full of paradoxes, because Franklin Roosevelt's policy, his program, his entire outlook was revolutionary like Hamilton and completely opposed to the actual philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. We can see that on one account, we can see that by what he did as governor of New York and then as president, where he used the power of the United States to create great infrastructure projects, particularly electricity and nuclear science. He used the power of the government to mobilize the industries of the country, especially after he got that power later on in the late 1930s, early 40s. He used the power of the government to protect the population. So all of these things were Hamilton's program. That's Hamilton's program, when it was put into effect, is what built the United States. And it was done in defiance of the British Empire. So Hamilton was in fact the man representing the interests of the common man, but because these Tories had attached themselves to Hamilton in the Federalist Party, Jefferson was able to get up a coalition of people in the streets to denounce this moneyed power, this pro-British Federalist Party. Hamilton was never pro-British. How do we know what was on Franklin Roosevelt's mind when he wrote that public essay, that article? Well, I found something in the files there that's never been published. And it's called Alexander Hamilton by Franklin Roosevelt. It is an essay on Alexander Hamilton written about the same time. It's dated approximately 1925 question mark. It's right in that time slot because he didn't put a date on it, but his secretary put it in there from that approximate time slot. That's the best estimate. It was written about the same time he did that public paper on Jefferson. And in this essay, Franklin Roosevelt describes Hamilton in ways that you can see his own heart, his soul operating, Roosevelt's soul. He describes Alexander Hamilton as a young boy in the West Indies. When he wrote an essay, when Hamilton wrote an essay, Franklin says, he saw suddenly, miraculously, that he had the power to move people by writing. And he got sponsorship to go up to the United States and get an education. When he got to the United States, there was a revolution going on. And then Roosevelt describes Hamilton as a college student in New York in a meeting, a great meeting in the fields, where the people are disorganized. And Hamilton spoke to them and organized them to be effective in their rallying against the British. And at that point, Hamilton again saw astonishing powers that he had to move people by speech. What's in Franklin Roosevelt's mind? What is he conveying by this? It's like a memorandum to himself, writing about Hamilton. He is discovering his own powers. He thought he was dead. He sees that a great revolution is needed, and he has the power to lead it, just like Hamilton. Then he says Hamilton had a great record in the war, working as the secretary to Washington, then leading battles, and then after the war is over, we have no central government, and there's a crisis. and people called upon Hamilton to save the situation. And Hamilton, according to Franklin Roosevelt, Hamilton was the leader, was the chief person responsible for organizing the Constitutional Convention and pushing through the Constitution of the United States. And then he led the fight to ratify that Constitution. In New York State, we know, and although this is not in this document, but it's in other references from Hamilton, from FDR, we know that Franklin Roosevelt's own ancestor, great-great-grandfather Isaac Roosevelt, was the chief lieutenant of Alexander Hamilton in that struggle for the Constitution in New York State, and worked with him in banking to outflank the British financiers. So he had a personal connection back to this, which he had known about all his life, but now he's seeing this through new eyes. And then he says George Washington as president, after Hamilton and his people were successful in getting a central government for the United States of America, the first president made him Treasury Secretary, and Hamilton stabilized the finances of the United States and thereby secured the Union and prevented its being dissolved or blown up by intriguers. And this caused the malice and hatred of Aaron Burr. And he goes through in this essay how Burr killed Hamilton from treachery. So that is his privately written essay at the same time as he's got this public celebration of Jefferson, whose political philosophy he never agreed with. I want to read you one other thing which makes this very clear about Jefferson is a populist, right? He misrepresents himself as standing for the interest of the people to stop the government from having power. Here is Franklin Roosevelt's memorandum to himself in 1928, and this everybody should take to heart. This will be part of the article that I've just written in Executive Intelligence Review about this whole subject. This is a memorandum written in 1928 by Franklin Roosevelt. He says, "There is no magic in democracy that does away with the need of leadership. The danger of our democracy lies in our tendency to select leaders who are similar to the rank and file of us, whereas the hope of democracy seems to lie in our selecting leaders who are superior to the rank and file. Should we hunt for leaders who will lead us or for leaders who will follow us? Should we look for leaders who will always think like us or for leaders who will sometimes think for us? Should we elect men to office because they promise to vote for certain measures or because we can trust their minds and their morals to guide them right on measures in general once all the facts are before them? Shall leaders be human substitutes for their constituents, or phonograph records of the fluctuating moods of their constituents? No man of authentic greatness of mind or character will purchase political position at the price of putting down his own intelligence and becoming the errand boy of either Main Street or Wall Street." That's his memorandum on leadership. And that's his statement as a revolutionary. That neither public opinion nor the false mobilization of public opinion by the enemy is going to steer his thinking. He is going to have to guide and educate public opinion. Now, in 1926, his aide, Louis Howe, went out and did some snooping to find out about what was going on with Mussolini and Wall Street. Wall Street made a loan, that is the Morgan Bank, made a loan to the Mussolini government of $100 million in 1925. And Louis Howe did some interviews and reported back to Franklin Roosevelt. And he said, the attitude of the Morgans, and he had interviewed the chairman of the Morgan Bank, the attitude of the Morgans is that it's all right to give this money to Mussolini. Why? It's their attitude that the great financial powers have created Mussolini and have sustained his regime, and they can depose him whenever they want without any problem. This is what Franklin Roosevelt understood. This is what he understood in World War II. What was his attitude towards Hitler when Hitler came up in 1933, just before he became president of the United States? His attitude was, this guy is a sponsored creation of the transatlantic enemy. That axis between London and Wall Street. London, Buckingham Palace, and Wall Street. Hitler's a puppet. And the objective is war. And we have to stop this somehow. Because he hated war, so he wanted to stop this sponsorship. In the last years of his recovery from polio, as he's putting together a totally new leadership for the Democratic Party, he defined the program. He said, he wrote, we are against free trade. The Democratic Party is not for free trade. We're against dumping. The people are afraid their lives and jobs are going to be destroyed by cheap imported goods. We are against that dumping. We favor the protection of industry. He's a nationalist. And he saw himself more and more up against Wall Street, Morgan. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York State. He began to plan the development of water power in New York State. And that is electric power based on hydroelectric. And he was at war with the utilities run by Morgan and Wall Street. In July 4th, 1929, just after becoming governor, Roosevelt spoke at Tammany Hall in New York, the political club. And he said, today is Independence Day. Let's think about our situation here. A combination of financiers has taken control of our industries. We're in danger of a new kind of feudalism. To go back to barbaric times. What we should ask ourselves is, do we need a new Declaration of Independence? That was his speech in 1929, and that was his point of view. There had been no depression. He wasn't reacting to any depression. He had taken control of the Democratic Party. He was increasingly in control of that, and he had to throw out the Morgan people who ran it at the top. He was battling from below to take over the party, just as we are now. And, you know, later that year, the entire world economy crashed. And he was propelled into a position to take down the control of the United States by the Wall Street-London combination as President of the United States. Today, we have to ask that same question. That enemy, that combination that gave us Hitler and Mussolini, that gave us the situation that we had to fight on D-Day, they have been recently given full power over our nations. Russia and China and India now are resisting that and actually building industry the way the Americans used to do, and the Canadians, which we don't do anymore. And so we have an unstable situation of very similar in many ways to the situation faced by Roosevelt, but now with nuclear weapons. So we have to really think of any local situation as based on a fantasy that there is some local solution to a local problem. The enemy is deployed centrally throughout the world, like in Ukraine. Who made that uprising that installed this fascist as president? This was done internationally. It was open. It wasn't. They didn't. It's not a cover up. They did it openly. So we have to think in the same way, and we have to go back to the kind of thinking that was successful in building up civilization. So that's it. Thank you.
Anton, I would like you to give a short bio about yourself.
Okay.
Like I had asked in the email.
All right. I was born in 1943, and 10 years before I was born, my father engaged in a bunch of lawsuits against Wall Street because they were in partnerships with the Hitler government. And he didn't make a political lawsuit, he made a financial lawsuit. He said they're swindling Americans, Hitler and these Wall Street bankers, including George Bush's grandfather. And he won every case that he did. This is well before I was born, but I found out about it later. He was in the Army in World War II, in Army intelligence. He'd been born in Latvia, so he spoke German and Russian. They were strong Democrats, our FDR Democrats, my parents. In 1966, I met Lyndon LaRouche. I was 23 years old. Kennedy had been murdered 2.5 years earlier. And I was looking for some way of getting justice in the world. I had always been political, but I didn't see any route to that in what was available with political parties. And things were getting nasty 2.5 years after Kennedy was killed. So LaRouche was giving a class in Manhattan to people who paid $15 for the class series on the second floor of this building on 14th Street. They advertised by a leaflet and a poster. My wife and I went to this class, and it was an economics class, and he said in the first session to those 25 people, he said, the financiers in Wall Street are changing the strategy and even the philosophy of the United States. And they are diverting all the credit away from development of industry and infrastructure into speculating. And as this gets worse, they are going to demand cutbacks in living standards everywhere. If we don't stop this, they are going to cause fascism in the world and a catastrophe. And he showed how the whole world economy was interlinked. He wasn't recommending a world government. He was just saying that world trade makes us all dependent on each other. He said that when you are finished with this class series, you will know better than the people presently running the government and running the strategy. You'll know better than they what should be done. And the only moral thing would be to take the world away from them. After that first class, we went out to have coffee, some of us in that class, with him, and we decided to form a political and philosophical organization to do that, to take the world away from this bunch of gangsters, this clique. The first task that we had, aside from trying to recruit people, was to try to understand what was this disaster that we were facing. What was going wrong? And in order to understand that, you have to know what civilization was that they were destroying. Because civilization's forward progress had really stopped many decades earlier, and particularly had been wrecked in recent decades. No knowledge, new knowledge that was significant had been created in any field. History had been totally falsified. The whole record of the greatest minds in science and in statecraft and in the arts, the whole concept and inner workings of their discoveries had been essentially blotted out of the memory of mankind. American history had been wiped out to the point where people had almost a cartoon idea of this earlier history. And everybody was ruled by prejudice of one sort or another. And so the first task was to go back in history, the history of philosophy, the history of science, the history of music, the history of strategy of nations, to see this conflict of our predecessors, the greatest scientific thinkers, to see them as they really were, and to see their conflict against the powers of this really satanic imperialism that goes all the way back to the dawn of time. So we revived, I would say, the two most significant things that you can start with is that our movement revived the ideas of Plato, and also put Plato himself as a human being, as a fighter, not just as somebody who wrote something, into back before the public. And from there, going on to the tradition that was revived in the Renaissance and in the thinkers who started the political revolution of modern times, like Nicholas of Cusa, and the scientific revolution. The other thing we did is we revived the concepts and the reputation and the truth about Alexander Hamilton and about those nationalists, the great nationalists that Lincoln was part of later. He was in the revived Hamilton movement of the 1930s and 40s, 1830s and 40s. Franklin Roosevelt understood it directly. John Kennedy really knew it. He knew about nationalism, and he was spreading this kind of idealistic, brotherly nationalism to other countries in Africa, South America, and Asia. And he tried to obtain peace with the Soviet Union and a partnership with them. So this concept of the American Revolution had been wiped from the books, wiped out of the public memory. We revived it. I was part of doing that. That's the best part of my biography. You know, so that's something that I hope to and have been happy to see, that practice of going as a very happy warrior into history and pulling out the most beautiful stories of this conflict that has created civilization when our side has made successes. That work has to continue. That's my life work.
Great.
Can I have a question?
Yeah. Oh.
Well,
Let's
Alfred? Oh, yeah. Okay, why don't you come?
Thank you very much. I'm Albert, and I'm original from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it is really interesting to listen to you telling us about 70 years since the D-Day and learning from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because now when we look in the television, we saw that the Western powers like the Empire of Great Britain, well, I call them Great Britain, they are not really great, but I don't know, my English is over. Of Great Britain and let us take the US under Obama, which is also like a fascist state. And now when they went to the Normandy, to the beach of Normandy, and it is very interesting to see how people fought and died to help the other people to live in progress. But in Congo, the corporations, the British corporations, and the British Empire, the oligarch, and with the help of the Bush or American government.
The Dulles brothers.
Yes, the Dulles. Yeah, they have occupied the country through the armies of Rwanda or Uganda or Burundi. But instead of the lesson that we learned from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to drive the enemy out of this country, they going all over giving democracies a way to deliver occupied countries. So I'm not asking a question, it's just a comment to see now how, like you said, fascism is being spread everywhere in the world. And the Congo is one of that place where fascism is really ruling.
So I would like to respond to this directly, because the United States and every country has the right to have the kind of world that Franklin Roosevelt was fighting for. When he died, the United States government came under the control of Wall Street and Britain under Harry Truman, and the Democratic Party was ruled by people like Averell Harriman, who's one of these fascist bankers, very close to Winston Churchill. During this period, in the Congo, some of this is little known outside. Obviously, you know it. But the Congo, which had been nominally Belgian, the actual mineral wealth was largely under control either of British financiers or people that were closely connected to them. And in response to Franklin Roosevelt, there was a nationalist movement in Africa. And I say in response to Roosevelt because before the United States came up in the world, all the people of the world saw was white imperialists. If something could come up against that from the West, then maybe they have a chance. After Roosevelt, however, the United States was governed for the next decade and a half directly by Wall Street. During the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy became a political leader before he was president in the United States. He was the chairman of the Africa subcommittee in the U.S. Senate. And he studied colonialism. And he made the end of colonialism his primary objective in the world. He was already making the enemies of the British, the Dulles brothers, and Wall Street in this period. But he was gaining the same kind of public support that Roosevelt had had. He was himself trying to revive directly the ideas of Roosevelt. Roosevelt was his commander-in-chief during the war. He was in the Navy and a hero out in the Pacific. So it was clear to people, to leaders in Africa, when John F. Kennedy was elected president, that the U.S. would now have a new policy. And after he was elected in November 1960. He was to be inaugurated, that is to take power, January 20th, 1961, 2 months later. 3 days before he was installed as president under our law, these fascists, the British Secret Service, led by Daphne Park, the station chief in Congo, Allen Dulles, who's a longtime fascist and banker's lawyer, leading the U.S. CIA, and the worst elements of the Belgian Secret Services, but particularly the British Secret Service and this Wall Street gang running the CIA. 3 days before Kennedy was put in as president, they murdered the Prime Minister of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, who was a nationalist. He wasn't a communist who's going to make communism in Africa. He is trying to do in Congo what Kwame Nkrumah was doing in Ghana. He was a follower of Kwame Nkrumah. And he was murdered just before Kennedy became president so that the United States could not interfere with the murder. Who are these people that are running the NSA now? Who are these people under Dulles who were running the CIA and under Bush? They're enemies of our country and every other country. That's obvious. That's clear. It was clear to Kennedy. When he came in, he fired Dulles and his 2 top lieutenants. One of those top advisors to Dulles in the CIA was the brother of the mayor of Dallas. And you can see a little bit of, look forward a little bit to what happened to Kennedy. The first man to visit the White House when Kennedy was president, the first foreign head of state, was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And Kennedy, with Nkrumah, built a great dam, hydroelectric dam, on the Volta River in Ghana. It's the largest artificial lake in the world. What happened in Congo then, when Kennedy was president? Well, the British said, oh my God, here he is. He's making noises about nationalism. What we need is something that's going to disrupt the situations, especially since Kennedy has problems with the Soviet Union in Cuba and elsewhere. We can go in and make this whole thing fall apart in Congo. So the British sponsored from Rhodesia and elsewhere with mercenaries and with huge amounts of money payments to separatists inside Congo, Moise Tshombe. They sponsored a movement to break up the Congo. And once Kennedy had stabilized his situation with Russia in the Cuban Missile Crisis and was starting to reach out to the Russians to stop the conflict between the U.S. and Russia, he immediately moved on the Congo. And he did the exact opposite of what Bush and Obama are doing, what Obama's doing now, this criminal. What Kennedy did was to get the United Nations to go into the Congo in support of the Congo government and to put down the British-led insurrection that was trying to separate the Katanga province where all the mineral wealth was. It wasn't just about the money. That's stupid for people to think that. They're trying to destroy any possibility of power for Africans, just like they tried to destroy any power for Arabs by creating this division of Palestine and by setting up the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth and so on. Typical. Kennedy went in, and in about a very short time, in 1963, defeated the British in the Congo. What was his objective there? It wasn't solved, but he had humiliated the British in the Congo. The British government fell not too long after that. He also told them, we're not going to help you get an atomic bomb. To the British. He was trying to stop the Israelis from getting an atomic bomb. So this is a revival of the American self-interest and leadership in the world as brothers on a simple program. If you build up the power of other nations, of other races, of other cultures, and make them powerful, and they're your friends, nobody can bother you. You're strong. That makes you totally strong, right? If you're a republic. That's our strategy. That's our national strategy of the United States of America. What does the enemy say? The enemy says we must make the United States weaker and weaker and use the United States to destroy nations and really to destroy itself. That's their program. We have to depopulate the world while we're doing this. It's quite simple, and you have, as you know, in Africa, in South America, in Canada, and in Europe, as well as in the communist countries, you have a false anti-Americanism that's planted by the British, which prevents people from understanding how they should act toward the United States. What do we need to do now about the United States? The United States is everybody's responsibility because the world needs the United States to take the role that it did before when the world made progress. The world cannot afford to have the United States acting as it does now. That's a disaster for the world. And it's everybody's responsibility to change that. And if you adopt some British point of view of simply hating the United States as a nation, you're just a stooge for the enemy. I know this is a difficult problem. It's an emotionally difficult problem, but you're stuck with it. That's the world.
Good. So Matthew, you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
And after Matthew, if Luke or Sam have a question, they can go ahead.
Okay. Good. Thanks, Anton. I had a few questions, but I guess the one that plays off from what you just went through pertains to Henry Wallace. And up until now, I never really had a fully satisfactory explanation for the choice that Roosevelt made to change his vice president, Wallace, who had a very beautiful idea for what the world could look like with what you mentioned at the beginning, the whole Russia, China, India, Canada, U.S. alliance and more for this real system of progress. And he dumped him and changed and replaced him with Truman, because in my mind, as far as I see it, Roosevelt had the vast popular support of the population, and I was wondering if you could go through a little bit why exactly that decision was really made, and why also Wallace, I know he created a political party to fight against Truman and that whole apparatus taking over with Truman, which didn't work out. But why didn't Wallace? Why don't we hear more about what Wallace did afterwards, or did he not do much into the late 40s, 50s, and later on?
The choice of Wallace, or rather of Truman, to replace Wallace as vice president in 1944 was forced on Franklin Roosevelt. It was not his choice. He did not choose Truman. He eventually went along with it under tremendous pressure. In a sense, it was similar to what happened with William McKinley back in 1900 when he was forced to choose Teddy Roosevelt as his vice president, and then he was promptly murdered, and Teddy Roosevelt became president. Back in 1943, Wallace had gone to Asia and had produced a pamphlet called I think it was called Our Task in the Pacific, or the Pacific World. I forget the exact name of it. And he described the world of the future after the war, where with our help, Asia will industrialize itself and become powerful nations, modern nations. The British Empire will be ended. All the empires will be ended. And the United States and the Soviet Union and China and these liberated countries will work together to change the character of the work in Asia, so that people are not slaves in backward conditions. A peasant is a slave. I don't care what the government is. And so this is a declaration of war on the British Empire as vice president. He wrote a draft of this pamphlet. Before it was published, he went to a party in Washington. And at that party, there was a British spy, and his name was Raoul Dahl. He's famous as a children's book writer. The Little Prince, no, not The Little Prince, another one, I forget what it is. Anyway, he was a member of British military intelligence, and he was at that party posing as a friend of everybody there, and there was Democrats who were also spies for the British. And this guy, this British military intelligence guy, got a hold of the pamphlet, of the draft pamphlet that hadn't been published by Wallace. He called up the British embassy. He handed that draft out through the window to a guy in a British car. He took it to the embassy. They photocopied it and sent it by cable to Winston Churchill. And Churchill said, we must prevent him from becoming the candidate in 1944. And the guy who was a top Democrat close to the British at that party advised Churchill, you can't publicly say that, because that would backfire. People like Wallace, and they don't like the British. So we have to do this another way. And the way they did it was to get Southern racists and people who are leaders of the Democratic Party in places like New York and Chicago, who were in bed with Wall Street to combine with the Southern racists in the party to threaten that they would ruin the party if Wallace was nominated along with Franklin Roosevelt when Roosevelt was nominated for a 4th term. And all kinds of pressure was put on Roosevelt. He was very tired. He was already showing signs of what was going to kill him in not too long a time. This is in the summer of 1944, the convention. He died the next spring. He was crushed by care and worn out by this long battle that he had put the world on his shoulders. At the Democratic Convention, Roosevelt said that he favored Wallace, but he would not impose his will on the convention. So it was not, he didn't really endorse Wallace. And Wallace went to the convention saying, well, I'm going to fight for the nomination. And there was tremendous support for him. A great majority of the Democratic Party supported him. And they used gangster tactics at the convention to stop his successful nomination. Harry Truman was brought in, and it was a disaster. When Roosevelt died, Truman reversed the whole philosophy towards the world that Roosevelt had. So this was forced on him. This was done by the British and their stooges inside the Democratic Party. Remember what happened before Roosevelt. This is crucial. Before Franklin Roosevelt was president, the Democratic Party had been ruled by a combination of Wall Street and the Southern racists that went all the way back to the Civil War and back to Andrew Jackson. And these people are murderers. So that's how we got Truman. This was British. The British prolonged the war by a long time by stalling the invasion of France and by other means of sabotage of this attack. They did nothing against Hitler, really, until Hitler invaded France and was aiming at England. So the beginning of the war, they did nothing at all. So this is how Truman succeeded Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't his choice.
Okay, good. Do we have any questions from Sam or Luke? And also people who are watching on YouTube, you can comment on the event page on Google+. I am monitoring that. Or you can email me. Any questions from you guys, Luke or Sam? Or questions here? If you guys don't have any right now. Pascal? Yeah.
Hi, Tony.
Hi.
So always great to hear about your research. And I was wondering, you're saying you're going to have a paper coming out soon?
Yes.
About what you've been digging up. I was just, I know that some of these archives are public, you know, the president's papers and all that. But what you did was to go to Hyde Park and check in the documents there. Is there a lot more from FDR that's not published at all, or is just hidden, or how does that work for these papers?
Well, I'll tell you what happened with this Hamilton essay.
Yeah.
How come we didn't know about this before? the first biographer of Hamilton, of Franklin Roosevelt, a guy named Friedel, wrote a biography a few years after Roosevelt died, and in that biography, he said that that Roosevelt wrote an essay on Hamilton when he was a college student, and it was just hero worship, and it was a trivial thing. And Roosevelt was for Jefferson, not Hamilton. And there was no footnote, because I don't know if he even read this thing. Maybe somebody told him about it. I don't know. It's a mystery. He was favorable to Roosevelt, but he's also writing in the 1950s when people were trying to forget about Franklin Roosevelt and just celebrate Truman and Andrew Jackson and Jefferson, Southern racists, and not Roosevelt. So other historians took that story from Friedel, that there was this essay that wasn't very meaningful, and was written when it was a college student. Well, that's not true. It was actually written at this time when he was becoming a revolutionary at the age of 40, 41, 42, and when he was talking publicly about Jefferson. So this kind of changes the situation. Historians generally, in the period since, all throughout the 20th century at least, have not been revolutionaries. And those who are truth seekers have had limited resources for one reason or another. We put together a movement with its own publishing capabilities, an international movement that could work together in different countries to help outflank enemy attempts to suppress what we do. They can't kill us off. And so now in the period of the internet, and also in a period where colleges, at least recently, had huge amounts of money. Now they're losing that, but in recent times, you've had this huge collection of documents that is still available to the public. And the only thing standing in the way of amazing new discoveries about history is the fear of people from going against public opinion to find the truth of history that's never been found. That's all it is. Every nation must discover their true history and must put that into universal history. They have to understand the central battle in the world. And if you approach the history of any man or any woman or any movement or any country from that standpoint, you are guaranteed to make huge discoveries. Guaranteed. That's not the way it's usually done, is it?
Great. Do we have a question from Luke or Sam? Or comments or thoughts? You guys are good? Good.
Thumbs up.
Anything here?
No, I'll ask a question if it's okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was very interested in your comments about Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, and I'm sure, as you know, that was one of the first countries that the CIA overthrew after.
Right, that's why I brought it up.
And I was curious about the OSS, learning a bit more about the OSS and how the vision and the practice of it was so different from the CIA, which came later with Dulles brothers and sorry, not the Dulles brothers, but Dulles and Cabell and Richard Bissell, who were all also in the OSS, and so what's the nature of that change? They're both in the OSS before, but I guess the mission of it under Roosevelt, the leadership was different. They didn't have leadership positions in there.
I'd say there's two things about the OSS. The obvious thing you said is Roosevelt's leadership. He formed that organization. It wasn't an old American. It wasn't a bureaucratic thing. He set it up. The second thing you have to say is that during World War II, as long as Britain and Western financiers loyal to the empire were agreed that the West should win the war, some of them that might have misbehaved within Roosevelt's organization did not misbehave. There were many people connected to Wall Street in that OSS. When the Normandy invasion took place, it was obvious to everybody, including the Nazis, that they were going to be finished. And so from that point, this is again the summer of 1944 when this whole Wallace thing is going on. At that point, Wall Street and London are in a full press to destroy the post-war legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. As soon as Roosevelt was dead, the OSS was dissolved under the plan of a guy named Maurice Hankey, Hankey, I think it is, a British military strategist. His plan was put into practice in the United States in 1948 to set up the Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. And this was done with the under the leadership of Churchill, actually going back to 1946, even after Churchill was out of office as Prime Minister. Look at this, what they did in Guatemala. Here in 1944, this New Deal Democrat, inspired by Franklin Roosevelt, had a movement that took over the government of Guatemala and began to take off the slavery that was put and backwardness that was put on that economy by the United Fruit Company and other imperial agencies run by this transatlantic finance partnership. So when the war, and our policy is called the Good Neighbor policy. That's the United States policy for our own defense. Shouldn't we have friends in South America and Central America? Of course. Everybody knows that. That's for our own interest, to be friends of the people in those countries. How is it to the U.S. interest to have people in Mexico hate and fear the United States, or only look at the United States on a money issue? I'm going to go there to get a job, but otherwise they're gringo bastards. Is that in our interest? No. You're going to have a catastrophe. You have a drug catastrophe. You have a gang catastrophe. You have all kinds of catastrophes, unless you build them up. Obviously, it's in our interest to build them up, to be powerful countries. And that's what Roosevelt was doing, trying to do. So he is out. He's dead. Truman's in there. Truman appointed, he's a Democrat, and he appointed Allen Dulles, a Republican, and the brother of John Foster Dulles, who is the main foreign policy advisor to the Republican opponents of Roosevelt. So he appointed Allen Dulles head of secret covert operations of the CIA, of the new CIA. Truman did that. And he appointed John Foster Dulles to be the advisor to the State Department. Helped start the Korean War. Their first project for the CIA, when Eisenhower became president and appointed Dulles chief of the CIA and appointed his brother John to be Secretary of State, their first joint project of these Dulles brothers was to overthrow the government in Guatemala, along with overthrowing the government in Iran. a democratic government that was trying to resist the British and appeal to America to help them. The British controlled the oil of Iran. The company was called British Petroleum Company. Ever heard of it? Yeah. In those days, that was before they changed the name from Anglo-Iranian Oil. So in 1952, the Iranians nationalized those oil companies. And the Prime Minister, Mossadegh, came to America and appealed. He went to Philadelphia and went to where the Liberty Bell was from the American Revolution and said, America, stand with us. And this Anglo-American gang, enemies to our country, overthrew that government and lied about what was happening there. Was that done for American oil interests? No, we didn't have any oil interests there. It was British. So what's the point? The guy was not a communist. Our Benz wasn't a communist in Guatemala. People have to understand this. This is not American interests. Right now, the government of the United States is not defending American interests as the U.S. is being wrecked. But I just say, we have the right in every country to have this legacy of the United States that the world depended on in the past. That was the first anti-colonial revolution. That was the model. We have the right to restore that legacy in the world.
In that light, how would you set the conference that we're having in New York City, the Schiller Conference that we're having next week? How important is that in the context of what you've discussed, the true American spirit under FDR and anti-colonial fight?
I think that we, with the recent campaign of Keisha Rogers in Texas and the kind of penetration we had in the news media and so forth throughout Texas, and with the developments that we have in Russia and in China, both, where there is very effective resistance to the craziness in the West, and also we just had the largest trade deal in human history between Russia and China, $400 billion for gas pipelines and other infrastructure, and plans for massive, massive public works. With this going on, and with the chances increasing that the public is dissatisfied increasingly with our government, seeing the government as not acting in their interests, I think that all that is required is some kind of a dislocation, some kind of a jolt that is associated with somebody in public life coming out and saying, we have made a terrible mistake in the last generation. We went on the wrong track. We're doing evil in the world, not good. We're doing evil to ourselves, and we are being led to that by evil men. That only has to be said in public by prominent people. And so when you get a concentrated public event of this kind, and you mobilize very hard for it, and you mobilize in Congress for it, and you bring some very famous political figures to it, all I'm saying is that you're getting very close to this kind of a jolt And once that jolt occurs, there's no going back to people not thinking, my God, these people are crazy that have been running our country. And not just the US, but the whole West. These people are insane. They're going to get us killed. They don't know what they're doing. They're not just evil or bad. They're crazy. All you need is somebody like the Emperor's New Clothes to break that publicly. And then you have a completely different situation because the actual reality facing the world is a combination of economic disaster and the threat of war, the threat of annihilation. That's the reality. People avoid that, and we're not the only people that are frustrated listening to these idiots lie and lie and lie and lie. We're making war in order to establish human rights. We're bailing out Wall Street in order to improve the economy. We're cutting the budget in order to improve the future of the people who are going to be left without any jobs or money. How long do you think people would tolerate that? Well, they'll tolerate it as long as people look away. And nobody who is quote, important, unquote, says anything about it. We're getting close to the breaking point for that, and we have to do everything in our power to set the stage for the breaking of the dam. And also, I think we should prepare for that by going to young people and encouraging them to revolt. And not just to revolt as some kind of crazy revolutionary, but to actually revolt in the revolution that we're talking about. But really revolt in school and outside school and everywhere. I don't think we can do it without that kind of revolt.
No, we can't. Well, with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation. It's been very good, very productive. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Will you be there at the conference next weekend?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, many from Montreal will be there.
Okay, we'll see you there.
See you there. Thank you. Bye, Anton.
Bye.